policy conclusions and policy communications. The last two lectures, we devoted a large amount of time discussing methods of policy analysis, various methods of policy analysis. In this lecture, we will be devoting time to discuss what are the mastery of skill sets for policy analysis. What is evidence synthesis? The principles of evidence synthesis, framework for evidence synthesis, the purpose of evidence synthesis, and choice of methods in evidence synthesis, different methods of evidence synthesis, policy analysis findings, policy recommendations, the criteria used in policy recommendation, and lastly, we will conclude with policy communication. These are the subtopical areas that we will be discussing. If you look at the realm of policy analysis, landscape of policy analysis, oh, camera is not on. Yes, noise on. The slides are coming up. Yes. Sorry, I think my camera was off. Sorry. So in the realm of policy analysis, in the landscape of policy options, there are four skill sets that are considered fundamental for policy analysts and researchers. It's not always necessary that a policy analyst or a researcher need to have expertise in all of the four skill sets, but a researcher or policy analysis need to have expertise at least in 2 or 3 of these skill sets. In terms of these skill sets, so that the policy analysis need to have mastery or expertise. Number one is data gathering and analysis. The policy analysts or experts need to have expertise the sources of data or the methods to collect data, analyze data in a manner that makes it useful in helping to determine the cost and benefits of ways and means of improving existing policies and selecting or proposing alternative policy options or choices. The number 2 skill set for any policy analyst or researchers, determining cost benefit calculus or cost effectiveness calculus. We use different methods of policy analysis. You need to have mastery to be able to attach a cost benefit value, whether quantitative or qualitative or both, course of action. It's phrase. Oh. Just to give me a second, again I will share. This one.
Just share. Just stop the share, stop sharing. And
Do again.
Sharing. Here. Yes. And share it again.
Sorry for the disruption again. I think there was some issue in the display as well as in the camera. Hope we have sorted out. And third is synthesizing evidence from evidence to information, policy information. The policy analyst must be able to gather, synthesize, organize, and communicate information. Analysts need to be able to quickly understand the nature of problems and the range of possible solutions to the problems. This is the most important step in policy analysis as well as policy making. Researchers may have expertise in data gathering, analysis, determining cost or benefit, conducting cost benefit analysis or cost effectiveness analysis, and a number of other types of analysis that is necessary. But it's often the problem that researchers face or policy analysis face is synthesizing evidence to information, converting research evidence or converting evidence of policy analysis into policy conclusions and policy recommendation. This is the most important component step in policy analysis and policy making. The last is implementation issues. Policy analysis, to a great extent, need to have an understanding of the political, organizational, and budgetary and legal environments that form the superstructure within which a given policy may need to be implemented. Possibly this last aspect of the skill set, this is possibly a stakeholder issue, not necessarily all researchers or policy analysts have expertise in this area, but a researcher or policy analyst will always need to work with the stakeholders and policymakers to be able to help in policy making. Now, this chart is about the dynamics of evidence-based policy. When you have the term like dynamic, it really talks about the evolution of evidence-based policy. If you go back in time scale, possibly, I think the evidence-based policy took a center stage possibly in the 80s or from 90s, in the last 2-3 decades. And perhaps in the decades before, it's largely opinion-based policy making that was predominant. So if you look at this chart, it's clearly demonstrate that we have reached a stage that almost most aspects of policy making today relies on evidence-based policy, what is briefly called as EBP, evidence-based policy. This chart talks about the factors that influencing policy making in public policy making and government, or it could deal with anything, policy making, even organization. If you look at it closely, it talks about 8 factors, that is experience and expertise, pragmatic contingencies, lobbyists, pressure groups, stakeholders, habits, tradition, values, resources. These are factors on the periphery, whereas the central factor influencing policy making in public policy making today is evidence. So therefore, now you all realize that evidence-based policy has taken center stage in almost all policy making. Now, what is evidence synthesis? Evidence-based policy making we have been talking about in the last 3 lectures in terms of policy analysis, etc. Now, what is evidence synthesis and how to conduct evidence synthesis? I was looking for a definite definition and the principles of evidence synthesis, and I was able to reach a fairly comprehensive definition of evidence synthesis. According to the Royal Society and the Academy of Medical Sciences, evidence synthesis refers to the process of bringing together information, research information or policy information from a range of sources, a range of data sources, and maybe subject areas to inform policy debates and policy decision on particular policy topic or policy issue. They generally include, the steps include a methodological and comprehensive literature synthesis focused on well-formulated research or policy questioning. The aim of evidence synthesis is to identify and synthesize all the scholarly research evidence that is available on a particular topic. It's not always the policy analysis is not always the end, but there is a need to look at the research evidence very closely when making a policy. Policy analysis is part of the process, but gathering research evidence is also part of the process in policy making, including both published and unpublished studies. Evidence synthesis need to be conducted, therefore, in an unbiased manner to provide evidence for practice and policy making, as well as to identify gaps in research. Evidence synthesis may, for example, include meta-analysis, reviews, qualitative process of synthesizing and visualizing data retrieved from various studies, research studies, or policy analysis studies. The Royal Society and the Academy of Medical Sciences has given a very comprehensive description of evidence synthesis. I'm trying to explain some of these. An accurate, concise, and unbiased synthesis of the evidence is one of the most valuable contributions to the research community can offer to policy makers. There is always enormous amount of research that the research community undertakes, and it is the duty and responsibility of the research community to make valuable contribution they can always offer to the policymakers. Decision making and publish debate are best to serve if policymakers have access to the best current evidence on policy issues. Despite examples of good practice, there remain challenges, a lot of challenges with both supply of and the demand for synthesized evidence. There is still a lot of limitations in supply of evidence-based policy options. Also, there is a considerable demand. There is still great demand for synthesized evidence for policies. So the research findings and evaluation system often place higher value on original research. This is always what researchers do. They place higher premium, higher value on research, robust research of synthesizing evidence, research evidence. But the problem is that lack of communication and understanding between policymakers and researchers, they create an unintended disconnect between the questions and policymakers are asking, the question that policymakers are asking, and the research that has the potential to provide insight for the policy option. Some of the principles of good evidence synthesis for policy. The principles for good evidence synthesis for policy have been developed again by the Royal Society and the Academy of Medical Sciences, because the subject of medical sciences and public health sciences, they use enormous amount of evidence-based research in health policy making and public health policy making. So that's one of the reasons the Royal Society and the Academy of Medical Sciences experts of this society and academy, I think, have developed a very comprehensive report on evidence synthesis for policy, particularly health policy focus. A report of the Society, Royal Society and the Academy of Medical Sciences, they outline a case. It outlines a case for evidence synthesis for health policy, which is also possibly it provides a framework for a larger goal of policy making, evidence synthesis for policy making. The report proposes a set of principles that define the fundamental features of a good synthesis to inform policy making. The report also proposes changes to research and policy landscape that would create a more effective marketplace for evidence synthesis. Continuing with the principles of good evidence for synthesis, good evidence synthesis for policy, the report outlines the fundamental features of good evidence synthesis, regardless of the practice of time frame, topic, or methods. They are intended as both a set of guidelines for synthesizing evidence and a checklist against which the quality of synthesis process and results can be assured. The recommendation, the report encourages researchers, policymakers, organizations, and others to apply these principles when